Today, we're outside Phoenix, Arizona to speak with one of the most accomplished private collectors of the last 30 years. He's owned over 1,000 bubbleback watches, as well as many of the most important complicated Patek Philippe's in the world. His name is Jason Singer, and today we're talking watches. So Jason, thank you so much for inviting us to your home and opening up some of your amazing collection.
It's my pleasure.
So you've been collecting since 1982,
Yes.
Which is actually the year I was born. So you've been collecting literally as long as I've been alive.
I feel pretty old. Thank you for that.
And so what have you seen change in those 32 years or so?
Certainly, the amount of material that's out there available to collectors has changed a great deal. In the early 80s, particularly in North America, there was an amazing amount of vintage watches of all kinds to pick up. And over the past 30 some odd years, that's dried up. There were just gobs and gobs of watches, and now it's really hard to find quality vintage watches.
Your first love in collecting was the bubbleback?
When I first started, it was Hamiltons and Gruens, but pretty quick thereafter, it was the bubbleback watch for a lot of reasons.
And what are some of those reasons?
Well, back in the day, in the 80s, the bubbleback watch was kind of like the $20 gold piece for coin collectors. Everybody knew what they were. At the time, everybody wanted one. And they were quite valuable, relatively speaking, and they were quite large, relatively speaking. In the 80s, people were wearing smaller watches, and all of these 32 millimeter bubblebacks, or the hoodeds, which sit much bigger on the wrist, were vastly larger. That, coupled with the diversity of style and the differences in reference numbers, attracted me to the watch.
Could you talk us through a few of your favorite examples?
Probably this one was one of my earliest favorites. That's a scientific dial reference 3599, a stainless steel hooded bubbleback, and it has a very coveted dial. These are first series watches. These are the earliest bubblebacks in the mid to early 30s. This movement is credited as being the first true automatic wristwatch movement. Clearly it was not that. Wigwag was around in the 30s prior to Wilsdorf making this movement. But this movement was a perpetually winding, always in motion movement. The weight is on a center pinion, and it travels 360 degrees. And so it was always in motion, and that's where the name perpetual comes from.
And the bubbleback also played a personal kind of role in your life. You're a physician.
Yeah.
And you actually paid for medical school with bubblebacks.
Well, with watches in general. Basically, I would travel around to Maryland and Virginia and various jewelry stores and watchmakers' businesses and ask them if they had any watches, and they did, almost always. And I would come back with a box of watches and put them back together and sell them.
I would say it's fair to say that your collecting over the past, say, 2-3 decades has really kind of focused on Patek. So what was your very first Patek Philippe?
That was this one right here. It's a late 1920s cushion form Patek. And I think I bought that in the late 1990s. It was in the infancy of eBay, and there was an amazing amount of watches from all over the world.
Yeah.
And this one came from Australia.
And there's an engraving on the inside of it.
There is. It was a gift from a mother to a son on Christmas Eve.
In 1920.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so I see a lot of perpetual calendars on the table. So what is this one?
So that's a 2438 in yellow gold. And I think it's in very, very good condition. It's a favorite of mine. It's a waterproof version of the 2497. So this is a 2497 in rose gold, and it has a snapback. And as you can see on this one, there's marks for a wrench, and it's a screw back, and therefore water resistant.
And the other perpetuals, the more modern perpetuals?
So that's a 3450 red dot. There's two versions of the 3450. One is where the leap year is demarcated, as in this example, with a red dot. And then there's this one here on the table, which has numerals that demarcate the 4 years of the leap year.
And then one of my absolute favorite watches is the 3448 white.
The 3448, of all the watches on the table, is perfectly balanced in terms of its aesthetic. I mean, the dial itself doesn't have the leap year indicator, which was a technological advance, I suppose, but kind of throws the dial off,
completely,
in my opinion. And then this being white makes it more understated than yellow.
Sure.
And
much more rare, for that matter.
And more rare. And I agree. I think this watch is as good as it gets.
And then, so I see two watches on the table that to Hodinkee readers has really become something of lore, almost potentially the greatest watch Patek has ever made, in the opinion of some. That's 2499.
Yeah, this is a third series, and the one you're grabbing is a fourth series. My favorite of the 4 series is the second series. A close second would be the first series, which is an amazing watch. And if they came in condition and the case had been more hermetically sealed and they had survived in good condition, in my opinion, the first series would be way, way better even than the second series.
Sure.
But of all the watches that I've seen, I've not seen a first series that can rival a second, third, or fourth series in terms of condition.
And so can we talk a little bit about what we have in these boxes?
Sure, yeah. So these are both waterproof Patek chronographs. The 1463 is the commonly known waterproof chronograph. This happens to be a rose gold example, and it's unused. This
Truly
watch,
unused.
Truly unused. This watch comes with box papers, original band, as well as the original clasp and hang tags.
So I take it you haven't worn this one much.
No, I feel obliged not to wear it, actually. This watch is a testament to what the watch looked like when it was born. And it's survived 60 years without being buffed, chafed, scratched, dented, or worn. And I sort of feel like it would be a shame to wear it and enjoy it, only because I can show it to scholars and collectors and show them what a watch looks like that's truly unused in that reference number.
And what is the chronograph we have in here?
So this is a 3651. The story with this watch is that it was born a 1463, and it was sold to a gentleman who wore it for quite some time. And in the early 1980s, he went to the manufacturer and said, "Can you recase my watch? I've worn it out." And they didn't have any cases to recase his watch, nor were they probably interested in doing so. So they offered the gentleman the option to make a new watch out of his 1463. So they took the movement of his watch and they threw everything else away. And they built this watch, the 3651. So while it has a recirculated movement, if you will, it's totally its own reference. And it comes in only 3 examples. The other 2 examples were also built in the 1980s. And one of them came from a 1579 movement, and the other one came from a 1463 movement.
And so something we haven't talked about yet is you spent many years as almost a VVIP for Patek Philippe. You were having some special pieces made for a while. Can you tell me a little bit about those?
So in the early 2000s, I was privy to the fact that the manufacturer made some of their important watches with customized dials. And I saw one that had been made for a very famous musician, and it was absolutely stunning and beautiful, and wanted to have something similar to that. And so I reached out to a gentleman who had the wherewithal to get that done for me, and we designed one that was similar to that particular watch and had a set of those made.
And that was a 5970?
That was not. That first set was a set of 5,004s.
And so when you say a set, that means every single metal?
Every metal, yeah.
And then you did that again with a 5970?
With the 5970.
And then again with a 5004?
Yes.
And so back to Rolex a little bit. You have owned many, many bubble backs throughout your life. And yet we also see some really special kind of complicated Rolexes. And then Rolex doesn't really do complications anymore, but you kind of gravitate more towards like the 1940s, 1950s, early moon phase stuff.
I do, yeah.
Can we see a few?
Sure. So this watch is probably my favorite of the moon phases, the 6062 in stainless steel. This has a 2-tone dial and has survived in amazing condition and has a warmth and glow to it that I don't think I've seen in any other 6062.
That's stunning. It's absolutely stunning. You have this watch in gold as well.
I do. It is an 8171, which is a different reference, but in a lot of ways just as beautiful and amazing as the 6062. While it's not waterproof, it's bigger and sits more flat on your wrist. Just an amazing reference in my opinion.
So you've been collecting for over 30 years, and I've realized that you are just starting to now gravitate towards something that in many cases really pulled people into watches in the beginning. And those are Oyster sport watches, Daytonas, Submariners, things like that. You're just getting into them now after 30 years. Why is that?
I'm not really sure. I can tell you why I didn't gravitate towards them for so long, and that was back in the 80s, the sport watches were utilitarian and not collectible at all. Almost nobody collected them. In fact, the GMTs and the Subs and the Daytonas, especially in the early 80s, were of no value. And aesthetically, they were quite similar. Nobody really discerned or scrutinized them closely enough to see the differences. And a Submariner that had 4 lines or 3 lines was still a Submariner.
Sure.
You know, they were just insignificant changes in aesthetics that really weren't credible in my mind. And in many people that started early, we just didn't get it. But I think that that wasn't because we were right. I think it's because we were wrong. I mean, I think we were just kind of old dogs in a new show. And there's no question in my mind now that the new sport Rolexes are amazing watches. I wish I had started collecting them in the 80s, because I can remember being at an NAWCC show and a Daytona falling on the table with a very well-known dealer.
Yeah.
And I went to bend down to pick it up, and he goes, "Don't worry about that." And he took his foot from underneath his table and scooted it back underneath the table.
So it's a different world completely back
Now, I remember Daytonas being $250 to $350, all comers.
So what in the Rolex world is really kind of striking your fancy now?
My favorite's the 6542. The Bakelite bezel and the different dials aged way different over time. Some have turned to maroon blue, some have turned to red black, some have been chipped and scratched, some have a yellow patina to the numerals. And then you get to the dials, and some of the dials are glossy black and they're perfect, and some of them are wildly aged.
And the watch you've been wearing is a gold 6542?
Yeah, this watch right here. I recently acquired it, and it's just one of my favorite watches. I think that this dial sometimes is referred to as a ghost dial, because this particular dial with the white print fades over time. This particular version is very easily legible, and the Bakelite bezel is preserved in good condition, and the case is unpolished.
You've amassed really a world-class collection of watches. And so what do you plan on doing with them?
Well, I plan on continuing as long as I'm standing upright and collecting more. And I think that anyone who collects almost anything, it's a living entity. This collection won't look the same as it does now in 10 years. But with that said, there are watches here that I would like to leave to my kids. I hope that on some level that they'll cherish them and love them in the same way that I do. So there's no doubt that I will keep at least a half a dozen of the very best bubble backs and pass those on to my daughter, because I think they're the perfect size for a grown woman to wear, and I think that they're timeless and historically very important. And then this particular 5020 I bought when Jacob was born, and that watch is his.